Welcome to Reading the Bible Together, and Abraham is about to get into all kinds of difficulties here in Genesis chapter 16, but I'm sure that many of you will say he only has himself to blame, and maybe Sarah. Now, you recall that God had promised Abraham offspring from his own loins, out of which a nation of blessing would arise, but so far, nothing. So we read, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. Not only that, both Abram and Sarai are well into those years when bearing children seems unlikely in the extreme, particularly for Sarai. Now, she isn't called Sarah yet in the same way that Abram isn't called Abraham yet. You'll have to wait a bit for that. I know that I tend to interchange the names. So while God has a plan, Sarai doubts whether or not that plan is likely to happen. And so she comes up with a plan of her own to help God along. And you can just bet that it isn't going to turn out well. In fact, it begins badly. We read, Sarai had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Now, the word translated as slave, shivcha, the Hebrew word shivcha, can be translated as female servant or handmaid. It's a low status position. Well, guess where they got her? She's Egyptian, so we have to assume that she's part of the ill-gotten gains reaped by Abram and Sarai's deception of Pharaoh. And like all deceptions, this one will come back to haunt them. So here's Sarai's plan as outlined to Abram. The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Well, put the morality of this act aside for a moment. Again, we're looking far back into the distant past, into a culture far different from our own. Consider it a pre-in vitro fertilization surrogate birth, but one with a personal, it will turn out to be very personal connection. And here's how it turned out. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. Okay, so far so good. Sort of. Because the consequences of Sarai's plan and Abram's going along with it are just beginning. Listen. When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress or regard her with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms. Now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Well, go back and read that carefully. Hagar now considers herself to be above Sarai in status, now that she's pregnant with Abram's heir. Maybe Sarai should have seen this coming, but who among us really anticipates the consequences of all of our actions? What we often do is manage to blame others for those consequences, which is what Sarai does here. You're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering, she says to Abram, who wisely keeps his mouth shut, although he could have mounted a pretty compelling objection here along the lines of, "Hey, Sarai, this is your plan." But remember back in the Garden of Eden temptation story, when confronted with the eating of the apple by God, what does Adam do? He blames Eve. And Eve blames the snake. And the snake's got nobody to blame. Well, here we have Eve blaming Adam. These things tend to come around again and again. So curiously, Sarai then says, "I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." God knows it's your fault, says Sarai, despite admitting that, it was her who put the plan in place. To this day, arguments don't have to make sense. There's always another thing going on behind the argument. In this case, it's Sarai's loss of her place in the household. She was Abram's wife. She was the chief one. And Hagar was way down here, but no, now things have changed. Who is she? Who is Sarai now that Abram has a pregnant wife of sorts? And is Abram, favoring Hagar giving her extra time, attention, status, a special place in the tent. All these things could be happening. We're not told, but in any case, Sarai is not happy. Now, Abram wisely avoids joining in the argument, and instead he passes the buck back to Sarai. Your slave is in your hands, Abram says. Do with her whatever you think best, which is diplomatic, but it's rather spineless, because guess what happens next? Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Now, mistreated, to say the least. She treated her so badly that Hagar fled into the desert. Now, the name Hagar actually means flight, as in running away, or forsaken, which fits here too. In this case, flight may not be a 100% death sentence. The desert is a harsh place to be all on your own, but it's close. Sarai's not coming out well in this story, treating Hagar so badly that Hagar would rather die. Well, Abram's not coming out very well in this story either. But God has his eye on the mistreated Hagar. We read, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? Where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. Now, angels will appear again in Genesis on numerous occasions. And in this instance, it is to send Hagar back into Abram's camp. Angels are always going to be bringing messages from God. That's what angels do. They bring messages from God. And this message is, go back to the camp. But the angel does not send her back empty-handed. He sends her with this promise. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, now remember, that's much the same promise that God gave to Abram. Your descendants will be like the stars in the sky, like the sand on the shore, too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. Ishmael means God hears. But it's not all good news. The angel continues, he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, everyone's hand against him. He will live in hostility toward all his brothers, which may sound like a typical teenager, but there's more going on here, and we will see in future sessions just how this comes to pass. Well, nevertheless, it's enough for Hagar to go on. She praises God, and we're told, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well where Hagar was found by the angel. The well is called Be'er Lahai Roi, which means the living one who sees me. And it's still there, adds the writer of this story, many years later between Kadesh and Bered. So, and the happy ending. Even though this story is far from happy and it will continue to have much unhappiness associated with it, we read, so Hagar, she returned, she bore Abram a son. Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Remember, Ishmael means God hears, and that's the name that Hagar then tells Abram that she needs to name the baby. Even though he's a dad at 86, Abram's story and his troubles are just beginning, as we will see next time in chapter 17. See you then.